evening, and welcome to another episode of the Axiom Principle. This night we have something a little bit special. It's a list I've been working on to try and identify an ideology in particular. There are plenty of ideologies out there. There's Christianity, of course. There's Buddhism. There's Islam. There's Sheiks. There's Hindus, and more. They all have things shared in common. Most people don't really take the time to see it. And so I thought it might be interesting to try and make a root cause list, if you will, or a list of attributes, as it were, to what would qualify as an ideology in general. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to walk you through that list in particular. But before I do, I wanted to bring up why this is so important and why you should care. Let's start with that. So there was an author about 200 years ago, close enough, that wrote a book that founded all of deism. His name was Spinoza. Most people are familiar with him. If you're into the arguments of religion, then you know who Spinoza is, because he founded modern deism and he gave philosophy a chance at explaining religion in general. He was also excommunicated from the Jewish faith because of his views and traditions, and particularly his philosophy on God in general. And that makes him the first openly close to secular Jew. Interestingly enough, also, Einstein favored his ideas of the belief and views on God. If God were to exist, it would be Spinoza's God. This is something that Einstein has said in the past. So I thought it would be appropriate to start with a couple quotes from Spinoza's book called Ethos, or Ethics. The first thing to know about anything is that the substance of which it is by nature prior to its modifications. So what this means is, in modern terms, is a root cause analysis. You're going to look at what is the core of an ideology, not necessarily its faith claims, not even its belief in God. These are all modifications of the same view, which is, I think, particularly compelling. So we have a classification of religion, right? And in this classification, we see Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Sheiks, Hindu. Those are the biggest religions out there, right? Well, let's bring us to the second quote and why this matters. They're all classified religions, but are they really kind of the same, or are they different? They have different books, they have different traditions. Some of them, like spawn from the Jewish faith. There's the biggest ones spawn from the Jewish faith, and so they're kind of connected. But how? Well, two substances whose attributes are different have nothing in common. So if these are all religions, there's something in common there, but what is that something? Next quote: the more reality or being a thing has, the greater its number of attributes. So Christianity in its belief structure, Islam in its belief structure, boast billions of followers. Clearly, there's plenty of attributes that constitute each of these religions. And essentially what this means is, to know what a thing is, you must know what those attributes are. You need to get down to the root of those attributes, find out what those attributes are, and then you can pretty much determine if somebody has an ideology in their head that is spawned by those attributes, which is similar to all their religions, or it may be something else because it differs in some way. And that would have to be by its substance, not by its modifications. So what you should do when you take all the religions of the world is do a root cause analysis of those religions and find out what is the core of the arguments. Most people start at the easy parts. Like they'll look at, they all believe in God. Well, no, that's not true because Buddhism does not believe in any particular gods. Well, they all have different names for gods. Well, that's true of all but a few. Scientology, for example, doesn't have any gods either, but they have a different belief structure. So what's the connecting thread? We need to break down all the way to the core attributes to understand ideologies at their center, to be able to tell what those ideologies are. So I took the time to try and list a few of these attributes down. I might turn this into a book sometime in the future, but there's so many that it's hard to break it down into a very cohesive list, and that's a huge challenge, of course. But I think I got the top 10, I feel, that are pretty obvious indicators of what an ideology, or to identify an ideology, rather. So let's start with the first one, which I think is pretty obvious, and that's fear. Fear is something that we all have, that we all live with. It's a part of our type 1 errors, where if there's a rustling in the woods, your innate fear makes you think that's danger. And it may just be the wind, or it may be a tree falling, who knows. But it's not danger in reality, so you make a type 1 error. You flee or fight. You go attack it, whatever, right? The type 1 and type 2 errors are the core of our emotional response of fear. That innate fear drives ideological thinking because we're also forward-thinking beasts. So therefore, because we fear death and we know we're going to die, we make things up to mitigate that fear, because there's no way to know what happens after you're dead. There's not. There's guesses, there's beliefs, there's religious faiths, there's practices. There's no real way to know, though. In a study that was done, I believe it was 2009 or 8, it was a while ago, the doctors in ORs and emergency rooms were having a lot of people say that they had out-of-body experiences. So what the doctors did is they put a clock at the top of the shelving, because most out-of-body experiences claim that they're floating in the sky and they're hovering above their body and whatnot. And, everything's so vivid and clear, and they can see themselves, and they can see the doctors operating on them and all that fun stuff. So they ask them every time, well, what time did the clock say? What was on the clock counter there? There was a number at the top of the clock. Not a single one could tell the people in the OR or the people doing the study what the number was, what time it was. And it was plain as day on a huge LED-based clock. It was one of those big ones. And this study was done with about 500-600 people in an OR situation where most of the out-of-body experiences were claimed. And it was pretty conclusive evidence that that's a bunch of BS. But it's still ideologically driven, because people are afraid of death. They make things up. They want to mitigate the fear, even if it's a subconscious fear that you're under the operating table, you're getting cut out, you're having a body part replaced or an organ part of it. So to mitigate that, you have what they call an out-of-body experience, which is completely up in your head. It's completely made up. So fear, I believe, was the motivator for such things, because it's the one that makes most sense. You're afraid to die, so psychologically you need to defend against that, because physically there's no way. The next one that I think is most important is faith. One of the things you'll notice throughout all the religions, it doesn't matter which one it is, they all have a faith requirement. And this faith requirement is best defined by Dr. Peter Boghossian when he says faith is pretending to know what you do not know. I think that's probably the best definition I've ever heard for faith, because faith is in the belief of something without any evidence to substantiate that belief. It's always based on either partial or no knowledge of a thing. So it's a complete faith claim. To give an example, as we were talking about death just a minute ago, the faith claim for the Christians is that there's a heaven and hell, and if you're good, you go to heaven, and if you're bad, you go to hell, and there's a whole bunch of rules to go either direction. You essentially have to believe this to be true. There's no evidence for this. There's no even circumstantial evidence. There's no partial knowledge of this thing to be true. So it's an assumption. It's a guess. And faith is required to substantiate that. Another example that's a little bit more secular is the wage gap. It's based on partial knowledge. It's not based on full knowledge. So when you look at the 27% or 20% wage gap, however you want to put it, it's been a fluctuating number in a variety of different arguments. You look at that number, and then you go look at the statistics, and you find that what they did was they lumped all men with all women, not even in the same job, and found that women make less than men. When they calculated in work-life balance, choice of jobs, choice of professions, they found that in certain professions, women made more than men. In other professions, men made more than women. For example, construction, men make more than women. In nursing and health and those type of fields, women make more than men. When you compare two in the same field, it's actually roughly about 2%, depending on the field. Still, that's a significant gap. But you're talking most people that are maybe government jobs get a 3% raise a year, and that's static. Well, in these environments, 2% is insignificant statistically. It has to be better than 5 for anybody to care. So there's really it's not an issue there. But based on partial knowledge, that the first part where you lump everybody together and there's a 20-something%, like a 1/4 almost, wage gap, an ideological claim is made. It's based on faith. It's based on partial knowledge. It's not based in evidence or facts. It's based on half of the facts. Another example would be the same rustling in the woods where you hear the wind. Your faith claim could say that that's happened a billion times before and there's nothing there. But you could be wrong, and you could end up dead because this time around it's actually a wolf. It's based on partial knowledge from historical evidence. You're talking, you've heard this sound a dozen times. It's kind of normal for this environment. So you let your guard down, and that's what it is. So faith, in essence, is an answer to ignorance, which keeps people ignorant. It is the placebo of the unknown, because we fear the unknown, type 1, type 2 errors. We apply a faith-based claim to mitigate that emotional pain of fear. Moving on to the next one. This one's a little bit more tricky, and it's a heck of a lot more fun because this is where all the arguments are made. And I call it faulty reasoning. This is a reasoning shaped from an emotional appeal and not a logical one. So we do possess an analytical mind. It's very possible for us to use that analytical mind. However, our own innate human characteristics of being mammals on this planet carries with it the emotional, how should I put this, reasoning emotional IQ, as they called it in the 90s and 80s, that you basically reason your way into a position based on pure emotions and not facts whatsoever. In a previous podcast, I mentioned in covering a book, Amazing Conversions, that the three things that cause people to go back to a religion was fear or trauma and depression or loneliness. Depression and loneliness kind of go together. Fear was one of the big characteristics because it was the fear of the unknown, fear of whatever, and trauma, death in the family, whatnot. Those type of things drive people to believe an ideological position. And it's all driven based on emotional-based reasoning. That's why it's quick for somebody to go from an analytical position, a position based on fact, jump straight to a Christian position, for example, because it's emotional reasoning. It's a sudden click. It's something at a base instinct, because analytical thinking or logical thinking is not inherent or the basis of our psychological makeup. It's a higher cognitive ability, which is why it's so rare to see somebody actually maintain logical thinking throughout their entire lifetime. Eventually, and it never fails, somebody's going to reason with their emotions. And it doesn't matter if they're the smartest person on earth or not, they will reason with emotions from time to time. It's inevitable. So what you see in ideological thinking is they rely on this faulty reasoning, emotional reasoning, to bring themselves or bring somebody else into the same belief structure. Christians use the fear of death and the fear of burning in an eternal hell for your sins to convert people to Christianity. Islam has a variety of tactics to convert people, up to and including intimidation, which is all covered in the Quran if you take a look and take a time to read it. Hindu doesn't have as much in there. Basically what they espouse is you will repeat this life and you'll continually get a worse life if you don't live a better life now. So if you're a rich person now and you live a crappy life, your next life you'll be cleaning gutters or something like that. It's a really kind of weird, well, it's weird to me anyways, dogma of rotating lives, I guess, not life, that just never cease. It's really, really bizarre. And they all reach to this fear, and they appeal to it and try to reason their way or make excuses or justify or mitigate the emotional damage through faulty reasoning, something that would ease the fear. Now, in the secular religious context, what they do is they appeal to ostracization. We're a social species, and either you're with us or against us. And if you're against us, then the potential of being harmed goes up. Their faulty reasoning in a lot of the arguments you see in the racial movements, like Black Lives Matter, for example, where they constantly bring up slavery, 400 years of torture, and now you owe us. We've been oppressed. We've been this, that, and the other, with no evidence, of course, so they're all faith claims, but it's faulty reasoning as well, because it's supposed to appeal to your decency. It's appeal to your common decency for another person. Since we've evolved as a society to say that owning people is a bad thing, and that minimizing or marginalizing people based on any attribute that's physical is absolutely stupid. And with that evolution, some people have taken abuse of that to drive a new set of ideological thinking. But you get where the idea is that it's all faulty reasoning. It's all for those that are really good with fallacies, is basically appeals to emotion, up one end and down the other. It's all based on emotional appeal at some level. The next very interesting one that I'm still kind of on the fence with, but I think it aligns pretty well, and that's the utopian ideal. And with Christianity and Judaism and Muslim and all that, they pretty much espouse that you get into heaven. For Muslims, 72 versions. Wow, I'm just not good with English tonight. 72 virgins. With the typical Christians, you go to heaven and be with people that you love. With Mormons, it's you enter into the bottom kingdom and go to the higher kingdoms based on your merits of a person and your status in the church, and you're all met with family and friends and extended family and family you never knew all welcome you with open arms. It's a big family-oriented type thing. With Hindu, you get born again into the best life, or you escape rebirth altogether and be one with the universe and just peace with everything, right? But it's all utopian. It's appeals to a better future that can never be, that are impossible, that don't exist. In the case of the classic religions, they all assumed that there was life after death, so they made the utopian ideal that life after death was better than this life, because this life sucks. With the newer ideologies, what you see is they espouse an end to all racism and all sexism and all misogyny and all whatever. And how they go about doing that is by using more sexism and racism and misogyny and men's misandry, which is exactly the opposite of what you should be doing if you want to live in that utopian society. Socialism is another good example where everybody gets an equal share. Property is no longer owned by people, but not by individuals, but by a community at large. You basically share with everyone, and everyone shares with each other. It's a very peaceful manner. Everybody gets along, that type of thing. In reality, it goes against the very nature of the human condition, where possession is something that we all drive for in some fashion. It doesn't necessarily have to be possess cars or houses or property. There is always prized possessions that people have, and when that stuff is taken or thrown away, they become emotionally wrecked. The easiest example is when you're married or when you're with somebody for a prolonged period of time, say 10 years or so, and that person goes away in some fashion, either cheats on you or dies or something worse. That loss is horrible, and that's in the religious sense. They appeal to your hope of being with those people you love again when you die. It's a utopian idea that just isn't possible. But it's essentially the way I can sum it up. It's a draw to a conclusion that sees a utopia, a desired ultimate outcome where everybody's just treated equally, for example, but is ultimately unattainable. It's not possible in any real sense of the word. The globalist view, for example, is something I actually agree with. I think globalism is a good thing. However, we're never going to get there because we are so very different from one side of the planet to the other. We are evolved into our own environments, so our own views, even our own cultures, can never intertwine. The culture of Islam is antithetical to all of Western culture. For example, I mean, they treat women like property, literally. They get some say in some things, but to give you an example, if a woman is raped, it takes 4 men to witness it, and all four of them have to say, yeah, she was raped, for a rape charge to be placed and convicted on the person that raped her. 4 eyewitnesses are required. That's preposterous. Predators don't do anything where people can see it. So essentially your property. It's ridiculous. But the utopian ideal in there is that you go to heaven and be with everybody. Except for women, of course. You're kind of screwed. You're property of whoever you were with. The unattainable view is another thing that puts things into perspective for the next one, I think. And that one is closed to facts. When I brought up the wage gap, for example, and that wage gap is been debunked a million times up one end down to the other. The original one was based on faulty data. The subsequent studies have shown that the wage gap is actually about 2% after hourly work has been considered, after work-life balance has been considered, that type of thing. It's around 2% per position, not per gender. So the wage gap has been largely debunked, but there's still feminists out there trying to portray that this thing exists, including the feminists that make multi-million dollars as actresses. They're wanting more, are not willing to earn more. They think they're entitled to this. Other examples are the really easy ones. For example, we have Betsy DeVos now, who is in charge of she's the director of education for the entire United States, and she believes in creationism, which is radically debunked and has been in trial. It's been destroyed one end and down the other. There's no validity to it whatsoever, yet she still believes it, denying of facts. That is why. They're closed to facts. There's actually been a quote that's bounced around a little bit, and I actually found the root of it. In 1721, a person named Jonathan Swift once wrote, "Reasoning will never make a man correct in an ill position, which by reasoning he never acquired." The modern day version of it is, you can't reason out somebody out of a position that they weren't reasoned into. Let me try that one again, since I stutter a little bit. You can't reason a person out of a position they were never reasoned into. So if they took it on faith, they took it on random beliefs, trauma, fear, they're going to be stuck there for a while. The only thing that can bring them out of that is by triggering them to reason their ways out of it. You can't reason their way out of it. They have to reason themselves out of those positions. In a conversation I had with a now good friend of mine who's a Muslim over in the UK, this person reached out to me because they were having difficulty in this very situation. They had found flaws with their own belief, particularly the treatment of women, some of the verses in Quran just didn't make sense, and it was very troubling. Instead of me just placing the arguments, talking down to them, making them do whatever, I treated it like a therapy session, and I made them reason their way out of their own position by asking critical questions, by sparking conversation, and I stuck out with it for several months. Come to find out that this person is a gay trans person that was stuck in the Muslim culture and had no way to express this, and was afraid of the acceptance of his family and acceptance of people around him, or her, actually, in this case. I don't think there's a full transition anytime soon, but they definitely were struggling with their own identity sexually. And the reason they struggled the most was because of their religion. And again, I repeat, reasoning will never make a man correct an ill opinion, by which reasoning he never acquired. In his case, he acquired this belief through family. And he had to reason himself out of it. You can never reason somebody else out of it. Here's some other ones that are kind of obvious, and I can give plenty of examples too. But this is where it gets a little bit tricky when it comes to some of these attributes. So one of the prominent ones is outgrouping, I think. And in outgrouping, you always see an address to those that do not believe as the group does. So if you have an ideological think tank, not necessarily based around a book or a belief system, they always have a way or always have a method to address those that do not think as they do. It is a social construct, a social grouping centered around the core of whatever the ideological theme is, the vision or mission of that religion. And so what happens is, and let's take the case of Christianity. In my experience, in Mormon culture, if you're not a part, this is particular to Utah. I have not seen this outside of Utah, actually. But if you're not in the Mormon church, you are ostracized. You are immediately thought of as a drug-addicted teen or a drunk, or you get into trouble a lot, or you set fire to things. You're always robbing and stealing and lying and cheating and la, 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 la. I heard gambits of stuff from my friends' parents, one of which was actually a bishop, which is about the equivalent of a priest in the Catholic Church, but it's like an elected position almost. And they used to say how horrible I was because my parents were also atheists. So therefore, I had to be of the devil of some sort. And I would get outgrouped. I would get bullied. I'd get picked on. And I contributed largely to the mentality and the mindset that's attributed to religious claims, these faith claims. Because I didn't fit the mold of the group that they're in, they immediately ostracized me. There's another good example. In the secular world, the Black Lives Matter movement in particular, what they'll do is they'll talk about the people that are in the group and they'll praise them up one end and down the other. But if you speak out against Black Lives Matter, you hear such derogatory, negative, ostracizing type terms that are meant to intimidate people into silence. You'll hear them, it's racist terms like Uncle Tom, a coon, sellout, whatever you want to call them. They'll get that type of treatment from those in the group outside of the group. So if you don't agree with their group and you actually have to fit their demographic, you're going to get ostracized. For an example that I experience quite often is I don't agree with feminism in its form today. I do with the previous forms where it's meant, like the Middle East needs feminism at this point, for example. Human trafficking is something I can get behind because it disproportionately affects women, and there's something that needs to be done there, and that I would think is a feminist view or a feminist need. But because I don't agree with the other components of feminism, I'm immediately labeled misogynist. I hate women. That's pretty much what misogyny is. I find that odd because if I hated women, my sister would not be living with me. I would not be married for 15 years. I would not speak to my mother and my 3 aunts. I would not speak to my grandmothers. I never had grandfathers. They were all dead. I only had grandmothers. I had a great-grandfather, but that's about it. I would have a lot of issues in my life because the bigger side of my family is all female. All my cousins, I have several cousins, half of which are female. You know, it's pretty split, and I would have to hate them all, and that's not possible. I don't hate women, so just labeling it on there is an attempt to intimidate my sense of decency. They're claiming I hate women, but it's obviously not true. The newer ideologies will do something of the nature of calling people Nazis, but I'm going to hold off on going down that road because in a couple of weeks I'm going to do an expose on this whole everybody's a Nazi insanity that's been hitting our college campuses in particular, but America at large. It's been an interesting roller coaster. So on the outside, you're treated ostracized through outgrouping, but then we have the next attribute, which is group thinking, which is now you're in the group, and what happens in this form is that the collective is more important than the individual. The cause is more important than the personal doubt or personal feelings. So in Christian examples, the in-grouping, the group thinking is that the Bible is absolutely correct. You need to follow the Bible, that the Bible is the source of God. And, it's basically your dogma that sets up the group thinking mentality. And the defense of your religion is defense of all Christians. Another example is the hate speech laws that have been passed and the ride that Muslims have taken upon that hate speech to make sure that they're a part of it, because that's a part of Sharia, that you are not allowed to criticize Islam. And for them, to criticize Islam is called Islamophobia. So what they'll do is they'll label you as Islamophobic, and they do that because the cause is more important than your personal doubt or feeling. So if you question their beliefs and you question their positions, it goes with the other one where they outgroup you and ostracize you, or maybe even attack and try to kill you. But it's also a part that they all think the same way. They all source it from the same book, if you will. The newer ideologies don't really have a book that they can go by, but they have a theme. They have a vision. They have a mission. It starts with the feminism is about equality, but then they divert that and redefine equality as equality of outcome, which is a socialist view, rather than equality of opportunity, which is a capitalist view. So it's a socialist movement at that point, and it's the core of it. And the importance of the group is more important than the individual. So even if you're in the group, I've heard people have conversations with those that are heavy feminists in the public sphere, and privately they'll mention that they've seen the data and they can tell analytically that it's all bullshit, but to remain in the in-group, they have to agree with everyone, because that's their personal doubts and feelings do not matter. It's the movement and group that does. It's the idea that the whole approach is more important than the individual. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. In this case, the needs of the ideology outweigh the needs of the individuals therein. So we're getting down to the near of the list. I got 3 more for you. The next one's pretty fun: the denial of reality. So every ideology has a claim to something that is real. And since we can go back to the Spinoza's quotes that substance by its nature is substance by it, let me try this again. Oh wow. Substance is by nature prior to its modifications. So knowing a thing, you can know by its substance, by its core, prior to you modifying it in some sense. So when you deny reality, you are taking the ideological position that something that counters your belief in reality must therefore not be real. Easy one for Christianity is evolution. We can see this happening in every species on the planet. Some Christians actually have no problem with creatures evolving of any way, shape, or form. Like dogs, we've actually selectively bred and applied the ideas of eugenics to dogs to get specific breeds. We've done the same thing to pigeons. We've done the same thing to other pet animals to try and get a specific look or specific hair color or what have you. With With evolution being so evident that we would exempt ourselves from that set of evolution is a denial of the reality that we are a part of the ecosystem, that we are, in fact, animals. We're primates, highly evolved primates. We're evolved in our private creationists in Christian world and in Islam, and to a lesser extent Jews, but they all deny the reality of evolution. Ironically, as I segue into this, feminism also denies evolution. It seems odd that I would say that, but when it came down to it, I've been reading a lot of work on psychology today, mainly just to keep my mind functioning and keep on top of things. But I came across an article where self-proclaimed feminists have argued with evolutionary psychologists for the mere fact that the evolutionary psychologists were men, therefore they could not be right. Never mind that the arguments that they're making or the studies or breakthroughs that they're making that relates to our evolved brains, because our brains do evolve, and they evolved from somewhere, right? Applying evolution to psychology makes sense because we can take the core of our roots, everything that we've carried up as an animal, and see why we do the things we do. But when you take the parts where men are bigger, they're a little bit more aggressive because back in the day we had to protect the family and all that fun stuff, and then you warp it to say that that's just sexist and everybody's a blank slate, and then you make a gender or gentrification type argument where everybody's a blank slate at birth, there is no sexes, and then you're conditioned by society. That's denial of reality. You're denying the fact that every person, male or female, is born male or female with different psychological bases. It's been proven inside and out through studies of, they've done infant studies of just showing pictures, and it's where girls like pictures of people, where boys like pictures of things. So boys are more possessive than girls, obviously, in those cases. So they showed that there's clear psychological differences. You put people in an MRI, you can tell if they're male or female because their brain chemistry and their brain structure, not the size, but the way it functions, is different. And that's how we discovered gender dysphoria, is to find that transgender people, male to female or female to male, it doesn't matter. They notice that their brains are wired in the opposite way of their sexual parts. And so they deny this. It's just they're a blank slate. So that can't be true. That can't be right. Unfortunately, they're wrong. And so they deny reality in favor of their ideology. The next one gets a little bit more dark. And it's one that we've seen manifest in several ways, and it's probably the worst part of our entire world history, and that is the treatment of traitors. So if you're once in a group and for whatever reason you leave that group, if you come back, you're treated with disdain, with distrust, with hate. In Christianity, before they